Hello, and welcome to the United Nations Overview, which also marks the official start to our next unit number 3, which will focus on the United Nations. In this unit, you will learn all the various details about what the United Nations is and the role it has in our lives today. Before we get started, it should be noted that this is a considerable large PowerPoint. There are a lot of details and structures that will be covered in this, so the information is quite extensive. You may need to take some time and pause to get fully caught up on various items as we progress through this unit. This will be very helpful for you to know where the structure and the politics, but most importantly, for the sake of humanity, falls into place. While there's many criticisms over the United Nations from being too bureaucratic or too slow to under the influence of one of the five major or uh, permanent members, it does and has always been there for one reason, the sake of humanity. And so that's why, as we start our next unit, we begin at looking at the overall structure of this organization. So let's get started. The structure of the United Nations. Early on, there was other organizations such as the League of Nations. Plus, there was structure and roles of the various United Nations organs and, well, organizations and members to it. Starting off from the Renaissance to the Hague. The idea of the United Nations was to resuppose the idea of nations. Going back to the Renaissance time in Europe, a time of rebirth of ideas since the fall of Rome, the Renaissance saw the emergence of European nation states that were generally under the idea and considerable influence of the Catholic Church prior to the Reformation. Through this, there was various battlefields that defined the realities of early geopolitical organizations. Armies held power, but statesmen were starting to think about some social and economic measures throughout the Renaissance. In the 17th and 18th century, cooperation amongst the countries generally were limited to formalizing realities on the battlefield, especially with the emergence of European colonial powers like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the style of fighting that was done in those imperialistic times. In 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, the shift finally went from seeing the results of a battlefield to focusing on what was social economic issues for the people, such as slavery, navigation, food, items like that. It also should be noted that the Congress of Vienna was very important in world history because this was a plan of the sorts of what to do with Europe now that Napoleon had been defeated once and for all after the Battle of Waterloo. The entire layout of Europe at that time period had been completely shattered by years and years and years of war with Napoleon and revolutionary France against, well, basically everyone in Europe that opposed him. By the time the Hague conferences began in 1899 and 1907, the parties had deemed that an enforcement mechanism was necessary. This was referred to as the Hague Conventions there. And the enforcement was, although limitations on war were primary motivation behind the conference, such as the Geneva Convention, with the protocols, the political posturing, suspicions of the participant permeated these meetings. Essentially, everyone was just interested for their own sake and not for the better sake of humanity. The descent into World War One ended the hope of with the idea of peace conferences. You can also check this website if you want to have a considerable amount of resources you can look at for treaties in particular. It is the actual topic of treaty and international agreements is a fascinating topic. One and topic that actually does kind of go beyond what we will cover in this class, but I know from some of your flight plans, international politics and countries are an interest because of your flight plan, so you may want to check out that website. So that was the earlier history from the Renaissance, Napoleon, such. After World War One, there was the League of Nations. Once again, in the aftermath of a war, first big one being Napoleon, now the First World War, brought the most powerful states together. Although the effectiveness of the League was limited by the absence of such key powers as like the United States, the League was still able to get much accomplished. We'll learn more about the League of Nations actually next week. However, one of the ideas of the League of Nations was to have collective security. But even though this was the goal for the League, the idea of collective security was never fully realized nor achieved because of certain countries that have been left out: America, the Soviets, eventually Nazi Germany, to name a few. However, despite the goal was never being achieved, the assembly members was structurally inferior to the council, which was the major players. The councils unanimously ruled, basically had the league backing to their call of interest. Now, with the League of Nations, from last year, you might have learned about, well, the failures of the League of Nations, whether it was Manchuria, the disarmament conference, or the invasion of Abyssinia there, which is true. The league did have several key failures, but the league also did have some successes, and that kind of is left with the legacy of the League of Nations. The League of Nations legacy, well, is complicated and it's not exactly well laid out there. While World War II represented a failure for the fundamental vision of the League, the vision of collective security and world peace, no more war, as the American president, Woodrow Wilson, had wished for, it did, however, stop meeting during the war, although some branches of the League did move into the United States and continue the work that they could under those new circumstances. What sometimes can be a bit of misinformation, the League of Nations, while not currently active during World War II, it still was not dissolved. It was not officially dissolved until 1946 at the San Francisco Conference when the United Nations was formed. And once the United Nations was formed, the League of Nations was officially dissolved. So it's kind of a weird overlap. However, with the League of Nations, there was some major lessons that were learned. First, they need to have independent enforcement kind of resources. They essentially needed a military force along with economic and political, and they need a variety of ways to use type of enforcement on the countries. Additionally, with the League of Nations, um, decisions should be made by majority rather than unanimity. Their majority thing about democracy with that. League of Nations should also be used for a mutual defense compact, power sharing amongst the most powerful nations as well as the small to mid-sized nations. And there was some resources such as the Avalon Project, and the UN considered itself to be a depository or kind of like a progeny, really, of the League of Nations. Now, with the United Nations, the UN, in the most simplest sense, is a treaty organization. Therefore, because it is a treaty organization and not like a world global parliament, as sometimes you might see in Hollywood movies, it has a charter. Although its organs, UN organs, do have some prominence, states can arguably disregard or abandon any aspect of the United Nations there. It will take a universal declaration or a letter of withdrawal, though, if a country wishes to leave, such as um, UNICEF or Doctors Without Borders. It's those various NGOs. NGO is short for non-governmental organization. But the UN also represents governments, not the people. That's a key point. It represents the governments of the countries that have joined the United Nations. So, with that kind of sense, it is not a world parliament. It is not comparable to the parliament that has been established for the European Union. Additionally, the UN resolutions are not law, but when followed, resolutions naturally do become like a customary international tradition that most countries will obey. And when countries do not obey this, there tends to be consequences, whether it's through international court sanctions or even sanctioned military interventions, as you read about in the previous topic with what happened in Bosnia and also in Rwanda. Now comes the hard part. The actual structure of the United Nations. The UN's charter essentially created 6 organs or branches to the overall well, layout of the United Nations. In the UN Charter, you start off with the Security Council, General Assembly, and the Secretariat. These are the 3 principal organs of the UN and are also were present in the League. Although relative to the League Council, the Security Council has divested itself of some of its power to other organs. Actually, one of the criticisms for the current UN is the power that was originally given to the Security Council has been lost. And now the Security Council is really dominated by the interests of the 5 permanent members, such as China, Russia, America, Britain, and France. Now, with the other 2 parts, you have the Economic and Social Council, as well as the International Court of Justice. In the League of Nations, the functions of these organs were used as a subsidiary to the principal 3. But now, with the UN, all these are fully independent branches with that. And in between theirs was referred to as the Trusteeship Council, which was charged with administering non-self-governing territories. Essentially, that meant assisting territories were a part of colonial empires to achieve their independence. It fulfilled its role in 1994 and ceased any sense of existence there. But amendment to the UN Charter is required to remove the Trusteeship Council, which has not been done at this point there. So it's still the Trustee Council is still technically on the books, but it hasn't been used for quite a few years. Speaking about the Security Council is a very, very important as well as prestigious body to be a member of. This is where major decisions are made for the entire United Nations. Now, using this diagram above, the Security Council is comprised of 5 permanent members. Once again, those permanent members are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In addition to that, there are 10 temporary members that have been elected to 2 years terms by the General Assembly. There is some rather bizarre geographical mathematical formulas of which countries are eligible and when they want to put their name up for a vote. However, decisions are reached when 9 out of the 15 approve in the council there. However, the veto or great power of unanimity rule requires the abstention from a permanent member if they disagree. Essentially, those five permanent countries that are part of the Security Council also have veto power, the ability to override any decision that was made. Unlike the other organs whose actions are recommendations to governments or states, everyone needs to comply with the Security Council resolutions, or there will be consequences to that decision. The Charter functions and powers of the Security Council allows it to investigate disputes or situations that might lead to international friction, recommend resolutions, including for settlements, call on states to comply on economic sanctions or take measures of force. They can also recommend military action against an aggressor and nominate Secretary General and the judges to the International Court. In a way, you could sort of see the Security Council is kind of like the Parliament in the, or the cabinet in the Canadian parliamentary system. Because the power of the permanent seats, i.e., the veto power, Germany and Japan have made strong demand for their seats. As an example, France was important in 1945, but why should it have more greater voice in either Brazil, Germany, Italy, or Japan 65 years later? There, the struggle is whether that would enforce the number of rotating seats, which will grow, let the country or the council grow to 17, which is an odd number. One of the previous Secretary Generals of the UN, Kofi Annan, has suggested there should be 24 seats actually for the Security Council. The previous American administration by Bill Clinton endorsed the idea of creating a regional permanent seats that recognize regions, but did not lock in a single country. You're starting to see how this gets rather complicated. With the actual kind of a structure there. But going back to the idea of veto power, the veto power has rarely been used there. But there has been blunt calls for restructuring, and council members have been using veto power much less frequently since the 1990s, coincidentally since the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall there. Additionally, although it does not have to include non-council members in its deliberations, Security Council has increasingly invited any quote-unquote central party to an issue for the council to listen to. This is what the General Assembly looks like. It actually is a gorgeous chamber there, which I think is very fitting of the role that it has for our society today. Now, the General Assembly is admittance to the UN that gives a country a vote into the actual General Assembly. Although the League's requirements of unanimity was abandoned, major decisions such as peace and security or admission of new members, budget, do require a two-thirds majority. Additionally, routine business and declarations only require a simple majority. While the General Assembly decisions have no legal binding force, um, they do carry the force of moral authority for the world community. The Charter gives the abilities and powers to the General Assembly, such as considering issues of peace and security to make recommendations for the Council, consider all issues falling under the Charter or its organs to make recommendations, initiate studies for things like international law, human rights, receive reports from the Security Council or the General, consider and approve the UN's budget, elect non-members into the Security Council. It is kind of like the world body there. If the Council fails to act on a threat to the peace because of lack of unanimity, General Assembly is empowered to consider matter immediately and what the collective measure could be. The last time this was done was in 1982 when Israel annexed the Golden Heights. At the beginning of every session, too, before votes are initiated, there's a period of general debate, which would call for like the various committees to do their reports. In the General Assembly, you see there are 6 committees from disarmament, economic, social, humanitarian, special topics, budgetary, and legal. Once again, you can see the incredible amount of bureaucracy that this organization has and why it is often criticized about that. Once a resolution is passed, UN organs, committees, special conferences, etc., work beyond the session to implement their decisions. Uh, The General Assembly recognizes that its resolutions have for its primary as customary law. Since customary law is determined by a number of states that comply, General Assembly tends to pass the weakest resolutions in order to get the broadest amount of support there. In the actual hierarchy, the General Assembly controls the Social Economic Council, but this is not exactly overloot or absolute or anything like that. It's lots of layers and death by bureaucracy. But the first steps towards international cooperation were made when victories and agreements were done on the battlefield. The shift in power from the battlefield to the General Assembly is really, really significant, as it shows we are now in the time where decisions are made by not who's the victorious or the defeated on the battlefield, but in council chambers of diplomats there. And even though the major powers in the Security Council control essentially the weapons, the guns, its limited scope has left the Security Council emerged as the primary body as a way to do what was unthinkable under the previous League of Nations. Now, who actually leads the United Nations is the Secretariat. The Secretariat is assigned to the administrative functions of the UN. It is UN Secretary recording and publishing treaties, gathering information, organizing conferences, managing the budget there. It is also executive in that it directs peacekeeping missions, advises governments, implements UN resolutions. Within the Secretariat, there is a Secretary General. He and the Secretary General is often referred to as the world top diplomat and mediator. I've also had it referred to as the most difficult job to have in the world because Secretary General is constantly quietly asking nations to pay their assessments, is a top mediator, is a top diplomat. The Secretary General needs to be neutral, a cheerleader, promoter, salesman, debt collector, father confessor. It covers many aspects to this job. And the Secretary General is also the researcher and budget drafter there. The Secretary General budget also gives the programs if any needed to be voted upon in the Secretary recommendations in the Security Council, but also in the General Assembly. During the one term or the second term, the Secretary General of the Council were frequently sort of deadlocked because of the Cold War, and some scholars have insisted there is important difference between delegated and charter powers. But currently, the Secretary General has 8,900 staff that are supposed to be autonomous, but every nation tries to influence the compensation of secretary for its advantages. Also, the Secretary General, there are no term limits, but generally speaking, no most Secretary General leaders do not go beyond 2 terms, and each term tends to be 5 years. Right now, the actual leader Secretary General is Antonio Guterres. He was actually a former Prime Minister of Portugal, very much involved in the United Nations for refugees, and now has taken over the lead role after Ban Ki moon had resigned there. And whether you agree or disagree with the United Nations, it often, for the leader, the Secretary General, they are the top diplomat, so they spend a lot of time listening, doing reports, being so like the mediator, and often they don't interject their own opinions on the topics at hand. Now, the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, is something that has only been in the last 15 years was primarily deliberative and consultative body there, but the decisions were rather marginal. However, its relevance has increased with success in providing coherent policies and coordinating various kind of projects there. If you want to know a lot more of these kind of projects, especially the humanitarian work going on in Africa, you may want to check out these two websites there, as it's quite fascinating. The ECOSOC, though, includes regional commissions like Africa, Europe, Latin America, basically geographically base. They have functional commissions, which will deal with a variety of ones from women to social economics to crime prevention there. And also, uh, they have kind of committees. Essentially, this is the think tank. This is the organ that generates ideas that could be presented to the United Nations General Assembly or Security Council. You get the ideas, the body for it. However, special or specialized agencies coordinate with ECOSOC rather than being directly controlled by it. Many are established by their own interests, which might have more members than the UN itself there. As an example, these are all the specialized kind of agencies that can be part of ECOSOC. Now, I don't would ever think that you would know all of them, but I have provided a link to each one of those, and perhaps you may want to pause this video at this point, and for your own interest sake, whether it's for your flight plan or what you had learned from your previous research, or some of you might be already thinking about your final project ideas, you may want to just explore some of these before we continue with the last few sections of this PowerPoint. But the General Assembly elects the 54 ECOSOC members who then create these committees. First world countries, developed countries, usually have disproportionately larger share of this. The caveat is researchers need to be aware of overlapping responsibilities. As an example, with a law sought to establish could be created by Secretariat, the General Assembly, or ECOSOC. So redundancy. Something you might hear quite a bit in the news when governments are trying to save money. They try to, tighten the belt, remove the redundancy, wasted money, stuff like that. Now comes the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice essentially has two main points. First is that it acts as a adjudicator between states. It usually does not try individuals. It just solves disputes between one country and another country, whether it's land claim, water claim, island, one place calling it theirs or that or someone else's. It also prepares advisory opinions on international law when it's requested by the United Nations body. So, first point, it solves territorial disputes such as the Arctic sovereignty between Canada, Russia, Norway over the Northwest Passage, or the Nine Dash Line in the Southeast China Sea, who actually owns that waterway passage there. And also, for number two, it gives the layout and advisory of ruling and recommendations on matters that the Council, the UN body, has requested. Likewise, the court does not have the authority to interpret the Charter the way the Supreme Court does for the U.S. Constitution or the Canadian Constitution. It just gives an advisory opinion. The U.S. Supreme Court, Canadian Supreme Court, that's the end, and no one can override those court bodies. But the International Court does have a body of 15 judges that would sit in and listen to the case. Also, states consent for the adjudication three different ways. First, you have a special agreement or a compromissory clause or a special kind of agreement with 65 countries that are also called a reciprocal effect of declarations. So more bureaucracy, more diplomats. However, jurisdiction is such a large part of the cases that these are not dismissed for lack of justification. They're there for merit. The state doesn't have to comply with the court's decision, but if the state does not comply with the court decision, the Security Council may act on the court's decision and do judgment. Decisions were published year by party in English and also French. They also, while the docket is quite light, the decisions were widely published there. So you may want to check out this source for it. Wrapping this up, the court, as I said, has 15 members, no two of which can be of the same nationality. Essentially, the International Court will have 15 different judges, and generally each judge will come from a different country. But even though the judge will come from a different country, they will not act on that country's interests. They are completely impartial and neutral, as no judge needs to be in any sort of court of law there. And the International Court of Justice applies first, there are international conventions. Second, there's international customs. There are guiding principles. And what is precedent there? It's actually kind of similar what goes on here. For those of you that I know for your flight plans are thinking about taking Law 12, as Supreme Court and other court cases will look back to what previous cases had set as a precedent. But decisions at the International Court of Justice are made by a simple majority. Both concurrences and dissidents are published, and this is complete public record. There's also a video on our YouTube channel if you want to watch more about it. So, to wrap this all up, that was a lot. First, you have the Security Council, which is essentially charged with peace and security issues. Those are binding. Then you have the General Assembly, which is a deliberative body. Resolutions are binding to the extent that they become law, and the bodies report to the Assembly there. All 198 members and the 2 observer states, this is where they meet. The Secretariat is a researcher, facilitator, administrator, and the Secretary General is essentially the world's top diplomat. Economic and Social Council creates reports to the General Assembly and is directed by it, provides guidance for policy, and coordinates in many important subsidiaries. The International Court of Justice dissolves and resolves disputes and provides opinions when asked from The Hague. And last is the trusteeship, which stopped major operations in 1994 with the end of the time of colonialism. Think about to our first year with what happened in British Hong Kong in the handover. That's a little bit of timeline for you. I hope this answers and gives you an insight into how the United Nations operates.